Good morning and welcome to Iowa Ideas 2021. As much as we'd like to be face-to-face with you, over the past 18 months, we've learned that virtual engagement can be rewarding and we don't even need pants. This session is Bills and Individual Rights, part of the Policy and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track. I can't imagine you'll have any questions for our guest panelists, but in case you do, submit them in the Whova app and we'll get to as many as time permits. This session is sponsored by Inclusive ICR Iowa. Here's a message from our sponsor.
Hi friends, Angelica Veneta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to check out our website at inclusivicr.org for upcoming events and our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
Thank you to our sponsors. Several bills were offered in this year's legislative session that opponents said put individual rights at risk, and whether it was limits on protest, restrictions on education and diversity training, or banning transgender athletes from competing, the bills have impacts on the future of the state. Add to that list vaccine and mask mandates or anti-mandates, as the case may be, gun rights and reproductive rights. In recent years, several bills have been introduced. Our panelists today, Gabriela Fuentes, a strategic planner for Planned Parenthood North Central States, and Kennan of One Iowa, the state's largest LGBTQ advocacy group, will help us explore how we as community balance individual rights with the common good. And Kennan, I want to start with you. Tell us about an issue you worked on during the legislative session earlier this year and its implications for personal rights, the personal rights of Iowans.
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw a major influx of anti-transgender legislation, as you had mentioned earlier this year, and there was, of course, the student athletics piece. But I think in terms of this discussion about individual rights, one that sticks out in my mind in particular are the attempts at banning medical care for transgender youth. Obviously, there's no argument to be made about a public health impact here in ways that some of the other issues that we're going to be talking about are trying to balance maybe the public health aspect of something against individual rights. In this case, it's really just a curtailment of individual rights, a curtailment of the ability of these young people to get health care that is medically necessary for them, and that their doctor has said is in fact medically necessary. And so that's one that sticks in my mind in particular as just a bill that wasn't trying to balance anything, a bill that was essentially just trying to strip rights from a small group of people.
Thank you. And Gabriela, from Planned Parenthood's perspective, the whole issue of reproductive rights is about individual liberties. And while you're not a state house lobbyist, while Kennan is trying to change lawmakers' minds at the Capitol, what's your role and who is your target, your audience? Gabriela, are you muted?
All right, now it's working. Thank you so much. Well, my role is to motivate the community to take action. So the community can realize that they are the ones who have the power to decide. That adds that pressure on lawmakers in Des Moines. Most of the time, people get intimidated by lawmakers, but the reality is that politicians should be the ones intimidated by us because they should work for the people who elect them. So what I do, I provide resources about how to navigate the system and find the information and resources the supporters need so they can take action. education about legislative process is key, so people can be aware of this amazing power that they have to improve their communities' lives.
Kennan, as somebody who has lobbied at the State House for a number of years, has the tension between legislative proposals and individual rights changed over that time, or is it just a constant sort of tension that you see from year to year, issue to issue?
There is obviously kind of a constant tension, and there's always going to be a tension when we're talking about balancing individual rights versus public good in the way that I envision it, right? There's always going to be a debate about where that line is and where it should be. But I do think, especially when it comes to transgender Iowans, that there has been just this massive increase targeting them and trying to remove their individual rights and their ability to exist in public spaces, which is one of the basic freedoms, right? Their ability to, go into an establishment, get a sandwich, use the restroom while we're there, and not be discriminated against, and just those little basic things that we take for granted every day. That's that, though. In that way, I think the legislature has become increasingly more hostile to certain folks. And not just transgender people, but that's just because of my line of work, the area that sticks out in my mind in particular. It seems like there has been an explosion in trying to curtail those folks' ability to exist in public spaces.
Do you think individual rights are sort of on legislators' checklist when they look at legislation, when somebody brings them a proposal? Is that one of the things that as they go down the list, they say, well, what's the impact on individual rights?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of lawmakers for whom that is like their number one priority, right? There are, especially when we're talking about more libertarian types, that they would say that is absolutely the number one thing that we're looking at is this a government intervention in individual rights? And I would say that they also need to make sure that that's not just the individual rights of the majority, but also for some of the more marginalized groups, their individual liberty matters as well. And I think sometimes that may get lost in the shuffle.
So is there sort of an educational process from your perspective that you have to sort of explain to legislators that, okay, maybe this is a good policy or it has its merits, but this is the impact on a marginalized community that they may not be familiar with or may not be part of their, what they see as the majority?
Yeah, absolutely. Or there may be something that sounds like a really wonderful idea, but it's going to have such drastic impacts on a minority population that it may be not worth it, right? Again, there's that balancing test. So one issue that comes to mind when we're thinking about this is a sex offender registry bill that had gone through last year. The proposal was essentially that if somebody is required to register on a sex offender registry and is moving to Iowa from a different state in which they're on the registry, that they would compare the two registry requirements between the two states and take the greater of the two. Now that sounds in isolation to be a good idea, right? We don't want people to be flocking to a state in order to get reduced registry requirements. In practice, however, what it is going to cause, and what I foresee it causing, is people being put on a sex offender registry potentially for life in the state of Iowa for something that isn't even a crime in the state of Iowa. So, for example, a few years back, we changed our communicable disease transmission statute, and in a fairly substantial way. It used to be that if you had HIV and you had a sexual encounter with another person, if you could not prove to a court that you had disclosed your HIV status to that person, then you were liable for 10 years on the sex offender registry and a 20-year prison term, which was extremely draconian and obviously was being abused by folks in domestic violence situations, et cetera, to keep their abusee quiet and to kind of use that as a piece of power over them. There are a number of reasons that policy needed to be changed, and it was changed unanimously back in 2017. Not a single legislator voted against that. So everybody recognizes that that was a good policy change. And yet here this other policy is going to come in and say, well, yeah, but we know that that is still the policy in, for instance, South Dakota. And so if you are convicted of this quote unquote crime in South Dakota and then move to Iowa, you would be on the Iowa sex offender registry for life for something Iowa legislators unanimously agreed was not worth being considered a crime. And so that's one of the things that I think of when we're talking about how this can have potential negative impacts on minority communities, even if the policy seems like a good idea on its face.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And this is why I don't think that, they think about individual rights, that they are part of freedom. I think that individual rights are okay for them when it benefits their narrow political agenda. So all the decisions elected leaders are making right now is not for the community's well-being at all. It is just for the base who defines what's the common good.
Okay. And Gabriela, when we talked earlier, you talked about a lot of these issues that you work on and one Iowa works on are intersectional, I think was the term you used. Explain what you mean by that and how it applies when you're working with legislators or working on issues in front of the legislature.
Yeah, so when I mentioned that they are intersectional, these issues, right, reproductive rights, LGBTQIA plus rights, I mean that they are social identities that intersect with one another and overlap. So when we are advocating for an issue, we cannot consider doing it in a vacuum because we do not live single issue lives. Intersectionality is a framework that helps us to understand how privilege had fed the oppression of these marginalized communities and what we can do to work collectively without leaving anyone behind.
Thinking about a couple of things that you've said, talking about individual rights, legislators thinking of individual rights in terms of who they are and who their supporters are. It's not, I guess it's not the case at the Capitol that legislators look at individual rights the same on every issue. Gun rights activists don't necessarily look at reproductive rights in the same way or vice versa. So is there a challenge in trying to get people to look at individual rights across the spectrum to say, whatever the issue is, the same individual rights should apply?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I think, at some level, that makes sense, that we would kind of weigh each issue in terms of the relative benefits and burdens of impacting individual rights or restricting individual rights in some way. But I also think that there's some merit in what Gabriela was saying, that in certain political circles, it's weighed more as how is the base going to react to this rather than where is the line between curtailing individual rights and the public good. You hear that in maybe the floor speeches, but in the actual calculations of the votes, maybe not so much.
So, Gabriela, when that happens, who's left out of the discussion and whose viewpoints aren't heard, and what's the impact of that?
The people who are most left out are the ones who are already marginalized. And we are talking about low-income folks, we are talking about people of color, LGBTQIA plus community. They are also the people who are the most affected by these dangerous and destructive policies. Recent polls have confirmed that what we already know. Iowans support access to safe and legal abortion and oppose the constitutional amendment. But this majority isn't reflected in the narrow agenda set by anti-abortion politicians in our state. And I think that you can say that is also the case for the most social justice cases. The policies don't reflect Iowans' values. The minority has succeeded in advancing their narrow ideology because they are most vocal and have persistently sought legislation to limit our fundamental rights over the past few decades. As a result, we have reached a tipping point and are facing a grim new reality. Texas adopted the country's most restrictive abortion ban, putting a bounty on abortion and empowering private citizens from anywhere in the country to police it. The US Supreme Court declined to intervene to block the ban. And this is an indicator of how they might rule in Mississippi case that directly challenges Roe v. Wade, the 1973 landmark Supreme Court decision that protected our right to abortion. Without Roe, it will be left up to politicians in Des Moines to decide if abortion remains safe and legal in Iowa. And they have already shown us that their intention is to ban abortion. They are laying that groundwork now with the constitutional amendment, which will allow them to regulate abortion and reproductive rights unchecked. These same petitions have decimated the state's family planning program, cutting thousands of Iowans from affordable sexual and reproductive health care. Their policies already have eroded Iowans' access to contraception and comprehensive sex education. Now they want to take away safe and legal abortion, which will force people into pregnancy.
So I want to go to a question from an audience member, and this really sort of encompasses this whole discussion: is how do we balance the general good with policies the state is making? And it makes me wonder: can we protect individual rights at the same time as promoting policies in the public good that are being determined, for better or for worse, they're being determined by the majority? And is this an all or nothing sort of situation? I mean, can we have more than one winner when we're setting policy that does something for the general good, but at the same time protects the rights of the folks that you've been talking about, the marginalized groups, the minorities within the state? And Kennan, I mean, can there be more than one winner?
Yes, I think ideally what we would want is to conceive of this in a way as follows. So something like there are some baseline rights that everyone gets to enjoy and that cannot be curtailed. So basic things like your own personal safety, being safe in your effects. There are several things that are kind of non-negotiables, or at least should not be negotiated in a democracy. And then there are other things which we have to do a balancing test on because they necessarily create conflicts between one person's personal freedom and another person's personal freedom. I think the mask mandates are a great example of this, for instance. I know a number of immunocompromised people who, because of the current situation, are basically restricted to their houses. They can't really leave, to get groceries, they have to get them delivered, et cetera. That's a major impingement on their personal freedom and their ability to kind of move around and conduct their business. Whereas asking people to put a piece of cloth on their face does not seem to be as large of an impingement on freedom. And so we have to look at those two cases and say, well, which is creating a larger burden on freedom here? And can we create a policy where the folks that are immunocompromised can still get to live their lives? Whereas, we create this other thing where people have to be maybe mildly annoyed at best. I think that's a good example of where creating a policy for a whole bunch of people to do a really small thing allows a smaller number of people to go about their lives in a more meaningful and substantial way. I think we see this in a number of different policy areas as well, where we can kind of make this calculation of, okay, can we do just a small thing so that more people have access to this thing that we call freedom? And that's where I see the balancing test. So like a baseline of basic rights that we're all entitled to and that can't be curtailed, and then a calculation in terms of how much freedom are we losing here and how much more empowering is that to other folks who are being impacted.
As we've talked about, go ahead, Gabriela.
So Kennan was mentioning freedom and, the public good. I think we need to think about who's defining this public good. Is this definition based on religion, on morals, on science? Who's defining this? And when we think about this majority, who are the majority? Most of the time we consider voters as a majority. But we need to think that there are many marginalized communities that they cannot even access the polls. They cannot even vote. So the majority is not always going to be voters. When we think about the majority, we need to include all Iowans, not only the ones who can have access to vote.
But isn't that part of the struggle here is that they're the ones who determine who's making the policy? I mean, if to put it very sort of crudely, if you don't play the game, you don't get to decide the outcome. And that kind of gets to a question I had is, does it matter sort of the size of the majority? If there's a clear majority, is it different than if a community, the state, is sort of closely divided? I mean, if we did a poll and it comes back 52-48, is that different than if it comes back 80-20, or when it comes to individual rights, does that matter?
So I think we need to expand our lens on that maybe a little bit. One of my favorite ways to analyze power is Stephen Luke's 3-stage model. So the first stage would be exactly what you're talking about, the people that are participating openly. But then we move to kind of the second stage and we move to non-participants, and why aren't they participating, and what has kind of shaped their ideas about whether participation is worth it or not. And further, what has shaped the ideas about who is a legitimate participant or not. I mean, there are a lot of people who live in the state of Iowa that cannot vote for whatever reason, and therefore they are excluded from this kind of calculation of who is the majority or not. And then, of course, there's the third lens with which to view this, and that's where are the parameters of the debate in the first place, and how have those been shaped through public discourse and have made people feel like they can't participate at all. So I think this is a tough question, and I think it's a tough question to resolve in a democracy in terms of how we get those folks back to participate, because there are a lot of folks who are intentionally excluding them, and who would love to see them continue to be excluded and push back into that kind of first level and say, well, this is the only legitimate layer that we have. And I'm here to say, no, I think just focusing on the first level is going to get us into a lot of trouble, because it's going to exclude the concerns of a lot of people who have legitimate qualms with what's going on.
And this is why I consider the grassroots movements and grassroots activism is very important, because I'm going to repeat what I said at the beginning. People have the power. So this is part of my role as well, moving these people so they can have access to vote, and we can change that majority that we are having right now in Iowa. That's what I was mentioning. Right now, those numbers show that the majority, it's because the consequence of voting. But we are working to change that with grassroots activism.
But you have to translate that into votes to affect the policy, don't you?
Yes, but why people are not voting? It is lack of education, because they don't know their context. They don't know who are representing them. This is all the information, all the work that we are doing behind so they can access to vote. And hopefully as well, we work with other organizations. So, we work with people as well so they can improve their situation in the country.
Here's a question for both of you. Knowing the makeup of the Iowa legislature, some people might ask, what's the point in fighting in a losing cause, pounding your head against the wall year after year? What is gained from these battles? I mean, are you sort of like the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike and hoping that it doesn't burst? Kennan, you're smiling. You're thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we've been incredibly successful at holding back a lot of this stuff, but the more that comes, the harder it gets, right? So it is tough. However, I think it's worth doing, and one of the reasons that I think it's worth doing is I think our arguments are simply better. I mean, I wouldn't do this if I didn't think that our arguments were correct, right? And I think the more exposure we can get for our arguments, the more people are going to understand that our argument is in fact reasonable, whatever constituency they're trying to support or whatever base they're trying to cater to. It's going to get harder and harder to make that case the more unreasonable your argument sounds, even if the base really likes it. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is that it's worth doing because it empowers the communities that we are talking about to actually start getting more involved. And as they get more involved, we're going to start seeing changes in who represents them, because they're not going to stand for some of that representation. The more they become aware of what's going on, the more they're going to ultimately be willing to push back on that, and be willing to push back on it in more significant ways as time goes on. So I think there's a lot of power in continuing to fight these battles, even from the exterior. If it looks like they're a lost cause, that's not necessarily what it's all about. Just because we lose a single vote on a single bill doesn't mean that that's all said and done. We can come back next year and we can revisit that bill with a new set of legislators who have a new set of priorities. So, it's not always just about the next 6 months. Sometimes it's about the next 6 years or the next 60 years. And how we talk about these issues and how we fight about these issues right now is going to have a major impact on how they're talked about later.
Yes, and definitely that's what we are seeing right now. Why choosing somebody who's going to represent you, it matters. Because while Iowa politicians have worked to strip their constituents of their fundamental rights, the Biden administration provided Iowa with much needed good news with the lifting of the Title X gag rule. The reversal of the Trump era rule means thousands of Iowans will once again be able to receive reproductive healthcare services through that funding stream. We are talking about birth control, annual exams, cancer screenings, and STI testing and treatment. These are vital services in protecting the health of Iowans, and they are being restored because voters elected a president whose administration took action against a rule that unfairly and for no reason banned providers from talking about abortion as an option in the healthcare. So yes, electing people who represent us definitely matters. And we put a lot of work into educating Iowa voters so they are equipped with the necessary information to make informed choices at the polls. I think that we're going to continue fighting for all the battles to protect Iowans' fundamental values. Raising our voices when we know we might not win helps educate communities and grow our supporters base, which help us achieve future legislative victories. So yes, every fight, it's very important, and we cannot give up and just walk away.
Gabriela, saying that, it makes me think that the legislature that you're talking about is going to be the same legislature next year. And so it's unlikely the outcomes from the perspective of Planned Parenthood are going to be different. So what do you do until there's a different legislature, a legislature that, from your perspective is a better legislature?
Yes, right now we are really focused on building our base of supporters and advocates and educating Iowa across the state about the constitutional amendment. We know that there's there's a huge need in this fight to raise awareness about what is going to happen with our rights. And we need to work to fill that gap. And having said that, we will always fight at the legislative level for bills that protect and advance sexual and reproductive health care and rights. And we will continue to show up against the legislation that seeks to limit our fundamental rights and access to high quality, affordable healthcare, because we know a majority of Iowans support safe and legal abortion and a person's right to choose when and how to have a family. Politicians in Des Moines, they need to know that we aren't backing down, and the policies they pursue need to reflect the will of the people that our elected officials serve. We have never been at a more critical time in Iowa when it comes to reproductive rights. And if we don't act right now, Iowans will be forced into the reality of living in a state without safe and legal abortion.
So at the Capitol and sort of in legislative circles and policymaking, both of you represent groups that are fighting for individual rights and liberties. Is there sort of individual rights lobby, if you will, that transcends issues that, regardless of the issue, they're pushing the cause for protecting those rights? And Kennan, I'll ask you, since you spend more time at the Capitol.
I mean, I think so. And I think it's, us, the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, a lot of groups that I don't think conservatives would envision as protecting individual rights, which is, I think, maybe the irony of this, in that a lot of the folks like that are often butting up against folks like libertarians who would say that individual rights are kind of the pinnacle of what government should be doing, is protecting individual rights. But we're often at odds with those folks. So they would not say that we are the individual rights lobby, but that's kind of how I envision it for the most part. Is it's us, ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, a lot of folks like that who are working to protect or even advance individual rights. It's just, I think the question is more in some of those legislators' minds, whose individual rights we're protecting, rather than are we just protecting individual rights. I think that's maybe the sticking point that we're running into.
I want to go back to something we touched on earlier. I think it was Justice John Paul Stevens said there's no absolute right, and that, I mean, certainly in my business we see this. There are libel laws. There are things you don't have access to in terms of information. We can't the old adage, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. There are limits on free speech. And so as you go into these discussions, these battles, do you have to be willing to settle, I guess, for half a loaf? Or I mean, do you go into it knowing that you may not get everything you want, and that in asking the community to respect the rights of whatever group you represent, you're also, in doing that, you're sort of taking on a responsibility to respect the rights of the remainder of the community. So how do you balance that? I know what I want. How do I respect what it is that you want? At the same time, I'm protecting what I want or what I have.
Yeah, again, I think some of this is issue by issue, and it's hard to honestly talk about in a really global sense. But I think your question is well taken. Anytime we're talking about lobbying or we're talking about legislative work, I don't think we ever imagine that we're going to get everything that we want. And there are always going to be calculations about, well, which components of this are more important and which are going to have a larger impact. In terms of, well, can we get this marginalized community a resource that it absolutely needs? That's normally what our top priorities are, and then we kind of have to tear down from there. And then there are also, of course, things that are complete non-starters. There are things where like that medical care issue that I mentioned before, we're absolutely not going to budge on, because there is no argument on the other side. There is no reasonable kind of impact on anyone else from restricting transgender people's access to medically necessary care. That's just an unreasonable request in its entirety. And so are there places where we can compromise? Sure, absolutely. And are there places where we're willing to compromise? Yeah, you bet. But there are also areas where it's completely impossible, where one person's proposal is just so unreasonable that it can't be entertained.
Yeah.
Gabriela?
Add that this is part of education of the community. So we're not going to reach that stage when a person is going to introduce a very dangerous bill. This is just time and education. If the community is receiving resources, is getting education, information, in a long term, we're going to stop choosing these people who are introducing dangerous bills for the community.
So from your perspective, the work that you do, it's about building the grassroots, getting them to the polling place, electing like-minded representatives who will be making the policy.
Definitely, yes. Resource, education, building community. Mm-hmm. That's the way that we win. That's the way that people are going to be aware of the power that they have.
And Gabriela, to go back to something you talked about, President Biden's reversal on the gag rule. In a number of cases, same-sex marriage, for example, a series of anti-abortion rights cases, the courts have rejected the policies approved by the Iowa legislature. And although in those cases it was the desired outcome, is this the way these issues should be settled by the courts or by executive order? Or I guess another way of asking that is, what's the proper forum for deciding that balance between the common good and individual rights? Is it the legislature or is it the courts?
The courts stepping in to determine the constitutionality of legislation. It's our government at work. Our government is built on a system of checks and balances. So this is absolutely how it should be settled. The courts were intended to serve as an unbiased check on the executive and legislative branches of government. But the Republicans in power, including Governor Kim Reynolds, have inserted politics into the courts in Iowa by changing the nominating process for judges and stacking the state's courts with conservative judges. We have begun to see the effect of this with the court's recent ruling allowing state to defund Planned Parenthood from its sex education programs, despite us being Iowa's largest provider of comprehensive, medically accurate sex education. And I fear that we will only see this trend continue. Most of the justices that were a part of the court's handful of recent decisions blocking legislative attempts to restrict reproductive health care are no longer on the bench. They instead have been replaced with conservative judges appointed by Governor Reynolds. Where should these disputes be resolved? In the legislative branch or the courts? We have a constitution that charges the courts with ensuring it is upheld. Part of that responsibility is to rule on that is the court's job. So when there is a question about the constitutionality of legislation, it's to the court's job to review that legislation and make an independent ruling. If it oversteps what's enshrined in the state's constitution, the court should be intervening and blocking bad legislation.
And Kennan, courts are always somewhat subject to the political winds. Who's in power is appointing judges, and even in the process that Iowa had, there was room for politics, to put it bluntly. Is that always in the back of your mind that as you're fighting for these on these issues that um, well, maybe the court will save us. Yeah.
We hope it never gets to that point. I think just to agree with Gabriela, ideally what we would want to see is, constitutional rights being expansive enough that if something does get passed in the legislature, that the courts can look at that and say, well, no, when I was talking about the baseline rights earlier, those are the kinds of things we would want in the Constitution, so that if something happens, judges can say, oh, no, these are the baselines. You don't get to step over these. Mm-hmm. And then the legislature can go about deliberating the other things that are maybe a little bit more on the margins, with the courts protecting those baselines. Unfortunately, I don't think our Constitution is quite expansive enough in protecting minority rights. Which is why we're seeing some of the cases that we're seeing now. I would love to see that, be more robust. But we're stuck kind of with what we have at the moment. And yeah, of course, that's always in the back of our minds. There's no system that's perfect. And while, Chief Justice Roberts would like to say that courts are there just to call balls and strikes, we know that that's not how it works in actuality. We know that there are political calculations that are built in there, or political ideologies that are simply inextricable from the way somebody thinks about the legal system or how laws should be interpreted. There are just certain things there where it's impossible to have an unbiased opinion and just call balls and strikes. That's not really what courts do at all, is call balls and strikes. In certain cases, they're saying, well, what is the strike zone in the first place? And should it be higher or lower than it already is, that we had said it before? And there are all sorts of other things there. And who is the umpire? And are they willing to call a strike against a certain group of people? Well, that's, I think, up in the air. So it would be nice if we had a system where there was an ability to just call balls and strikes. But unfortunately, social issues and legal issues are way more complicated than just calling balls and strikes. And that's not a feasible model.
There's a wide strike zone and a low strike zone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and
if
also
you
this
watch
little
baseball
pocket right over here for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. One of the things we really haven't talked about, sort of what became an individual rights argument this past year, was mask mandates, and many schools, as we've seen, have wanted to require masks for students and teachers, and some businesses have wanted to require masks for customers and people doing business there, and this was framed by some people as an individual rights issue, that I should be able to just decide whether or not I'm going to wear a mask, or I should be able to wear or decide whether or not my children are going to wear masks to schools. Gabriela, does it seem sort of ironic to Planned Parenthood that some of the arguments we were hearing sounded very similar to arguments that abortion rights supporters have made, sort of the my body, my choice arguments? Have you found some new allies?
Well, there's definitely a lot of irony there. Even hypocritical to talk about their body, their choice, when it comes to putting a mask on to protect themselves and others from a deadly virus. And then they say, but I want to control your body and your ability to make decisions that affect your future. I just think that doesn't match up.
Well, and I'll go. I mean, I mentioned this at the beginning, where I think that the mask thing is really maybe in the way that you had just pitched it now, or in the way that the anti-mask advocates would like to pitch it, I think is a complete misinterpretation of where the rights are coming in, right? And we've just seen this in the recent court case that came down about that mask mandate, where the court said, okay, well, here's the deal, though. You are massively curtailing the ability of students with disabilities to participate in class, to get a good education, to get an equal education to their peers by not allowing these mask mandates. And so, again, we're talking about massively curtailing the individual rights of a marginalized community in order to not burden the majority with again, something that maybe is a mild annoyance at best, something that's not really restricting their ability to go to a store or travel or anything else, whereas it is restricting these folks with the disabilities ability to do any of those basic things. I think it's a fairly easy argument to make that the individual rights of those folks are seriously impacted, whereas the individual rights of folks who don't want to wear a mask are really not impacted in a meaningful way at all.
Looking ahead, I assume that in the coming session of the legislature in 2022, many of the same issues that were debated this year will be debated again next year. Kennan, let me start with you. Do you, I'm sure there are always surprises, but what do you expect in the next session?
We have seen the trajectory of anti-transgender legislation, not just in Iowa, but across the U.S. And I think that trend is unfortunately going to continue. So, just as an example here, in the United States, in 2019, there were 35 anti-transgender bills across the country. 2020, that number goes up to 100. And then this year, we saw more than 170 of them. And that is mimicked in Iowa as well. We had 15 anti-LGBTQ bills, 13 of those were transgender specific, and 8, over half, were specific to transgender youth. So it does seem like there's a concentrated attack trying to get at the rights of transgender people, and particularly transgender young people. So I expect that there will be some movement on some piece of legislation impacting transgender youth over the coming year. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball and I can't tell you exactly which piece of legislation is going to move, but I can say that the governor going on Fox News and calling for a youth sports exclusion is a very troublesome sign for us.
Mm-hmm. And that was introduced and then withdrawn in this past session of the legislature. So yeah, it's out there. And Gabriela, you've talked about sort of what Planned Parenthood is expecting in terms of a Texas-like legislation. And I don't know if there's more you want to say about that, but I mean, certainly that's been the direction we've seen from the legislature.
Yes, Iowa can be the next Texas. And this means that we are expecting more attacks for anti-reaper rates. Definitely the constitutional amendment is going to continue moving. So we are just ready. That's why we are building our community. We need to be ready for next fights.
We have a question here from an audience member who's asking, and this maybe gets in more philosophical, but says, since the church in more conservative theological circles is viewed as antithetical to the world, how can church officials work collegially with those whose orientation and praxis lead to conflicts and disagreements? And I guess that, how do you work on these issues when you come from different perspectives?
I mean, I think we have to recognize those differences, but what I try to do in my job is always try to find, when I'm talking with somebody, what our common ground is. And if we can start from, well, we might disagree on these 10 principles, but we can agree on these 3 principles. I'm not going to worry about the 10 for a while. I'm going to focus on those 3 and see what kind of structure we can build up from there that we actually agree on. And can we get to a place from that basic structure to where we can do something meaningful? And oftentimes I think the answer is yes, even with folks that may be on the complete polar opposite side of my viewpoint. I think there's probably some room for agreement there. Now, are we going to be able to tenably solve a lot of problems from that structure off of a few principles? Probably not. But there is always room to do something. And that's where I'm, as a lobbyist, always trying to think of where that next thing might be, where we can find some pocket of agreement and then expand from that point.
I will say that just continue having this difficult conversations. I mentioned it many times during our interview today. Education is key. So just continue talking to your people. Even with our coalition partners, we don't always agree on the same issues, but we know that our voices are stronger together than individually. So just keep that in mind. Even though when you don't agree with a different perspective than yours, it's important to listen and continue having conversations and take action together.
So it really comes down to relationship building and education and just continuing the conversation. And like you said, Kennan, trying to find that one thing that you can agree on or at least have in common to use as a starting point, whether it's you both like dogs or you don't like the cafeteria coffee. I mean, it's a starting point, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, one legislator and I started from the point of we both like the movie A Christmas Story. Now, where can we go from there?
Well, there you go. I mean, I guess you could each see some good in the other if you like that. Yeah. Well, we've come down to our ending time, and I want to thank our audience for joining us today. I want to thank Gabriela and Kennan for sharing their time and their perspectives, and then I want to also remind you to check your schedule for more Iowa Ideas discussions. You can go to www.iowaideas.com/schedule. Also a reminder that at 12:30, Iowa Department of Human Services Director Kelly Garcia will sit down for a one-on-one interview with Gazette editor Zach Kucharski. And then at 1:15, Zach will be talking to Governor Kim Reynolds, today's Iowa Ideas featured speaker. Again, thanks to Gabriela Fuentes and Kennan Crow and our audience. Thanks for joining us for Iowa Ideas 2021.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.